All right, so get this. Everyone knows BlackRock, right? They manage like a gazillion
He's a
dollars.
lot, yeah.
So when their CEO, Larry Fink, starts talking about the future, people tend to listen, right? It's their 25th anniversary,
Huge milestone.
and their stock is up. Like, what is it?
Almost 11,000%.
It's bonkers. Anyway, we got Fink's latest interview, and he's laying out some pretty bold predictions about where the global economy is headed over the next 25 years.
He's definitely got a unique perspective.
Absolutely. So one of the things he keeps coming back to is this idea that we're seeing this massive shift towards capital markets globally.
Right, he's really emphasizing that.
Yeah, and he even specifically called out, Europe, Japan, India as examples.
And what's interesting about that is it kind of signals this move away from, like, the traditional banking systems you're used to, right? Like, we could be headed towards a future where investment and therefore economic influence is way more diverse and interconnected globally.
I mean, what does that even mean for the average investor? Is it more risk, more opportunity? It's kind of mind-blowing.
It's definitely something to watch.
For sure. But speaking of opportunity, Fink is super bullish on infrastructure.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. He calls it like a dawning opportunity. And get this, BlackRock just closed this massive $25 billion infrastructure product, and they're partnering up with some big names. Microsoft, NVIDIA, even MGM.
Wow, that's a pretty clear sign they're serious about it.
Right. It's not just talk.
No, definitely not.
But it makes sense, though, right?
Yeah.
Infrastructure kind of solves a lot of problems at once.
It does, yeah.
Like, we need to decarbonize, we need better digital infrastructure, and everyone always talks about wanting private investment instead of just government spending.
Right, ticks a lot of boxes.
It does. Although I can already hear some people saying, oh, great, is infrastructure going to be the new ESG? Is it going to get bogged down in politics?
It's a fair question.
It is, but Fink actually thinks that the need for that private capital is going to be so huge that it'll basically force things to move forward.
He's probably right about that. I mean, the need is definitely there.
Definitely. Okay, but here's where things get a little tricky.
Oh, how so?
So Fink admits, we're in a volatile market right now. He even mentioned the whole commercial real estate downturn.
Right, that's been a big story.
Huge, but he also thinks that all this growth in global capital markets that we were just talking about actually makes the whole system less risky.
Less risky. How does that work?
Yeah, it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but it comes down to diversification.
Ah, spreading the risk.
Exactly. Like, instead of having all your eggs in one basket, you've got them spread out across a bunch of different baskets.
Makes sense.
So it's like, yeah, lending to one company might be riskier for that one deal, but overall it's actually less risky than a bank holding a ton of loans bundled all together.
Right, so it's less likely one big thing can cause a meltdown, like in 2008.
Exactly. And Fink sees this happening in a lot of areas, especially private credit.
Which he's a big proponent of, right?
Yeah, he says it's chiefly matching a liability and an asset together. Like basically just more direct lending.
Interesting. So should we all be dumping our savings into private credit now?
Well, hold on. He's not saying it's completely risk-free or anything, but it's definitely something he sees as like a sign of things to come.
Okay, so it's more about like understanding how risk is changing as these global capital markets grow.
Exactly. And maybe prompting us to think about where the, smart money is going to flow in the next, 5-10 years.
I get it. Yeah, it's about spotting those long-term trends.
Totally. So speaking of long-term trends, let's talk about China for a second, because Fink had some interesting things to say about that, too.
Okay, what's his take?
Well, he's definitely noticed that they're, trying to stabilize their economy, like there have been some policy shifts and stuff.
Right, they've been trying to boost growth.
Yeah, but he's not convinced it's going to be enough to, totally restore confidence.
Interesting. And we know how important confidence is.
Oh, totally. I mean, remember what happened with the supply chains a couple of years ago? When that goes, things get messy.
Yeah, and Fink actually thinks we might see a bit of a downdraft for China as more companies look to, diversify their supply chains.
Which, by the way, huge lesson from the whole pandemic debacle.
Yeah, resilience is key.
Absolutely. But anyway, Fink sees companies looking at other places like India, the Philippines, Vietnam, even Mexico.
Makes sense. Got to spread the risk.
Exactly. Okay, so I got to ask, because it's the elephant in the room, what about the U.S. election? Everyone wants to know, what does Larry Fink think?
Everyone's wondering if it'll impact the markets.
Right. Well, get this. He thinks that both candidates basically have pretty similar goals when it comes to, making the U.S. economy stronger.
Really? That's kind of surprising.
I know, right? So does that mean no matter who wins, we're all going to be sipping champagne and celebrating
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
Probably not.
But I think his point is that, at least from an economic perspective, your investment strategy shouldn't totally hinge on who's in the White House.
It's more about the long game.
Exactly. And he's very clear about still seeing the U.S. as a really strong place to invest for the long haul, regardless of those short-term political swings.
It's like tuning out the day-to-day noise and focusing on the bigger trends, right?
Exactly, which can be hard to do when everyone's yelling about the latest crisis.
Tell me about it, but he's got a point, doesn't he?
He does, and Fink's definitely someone who's built a career on spotting those long-term trends.
No doubt. Now, speaking of long-term trends, he's also a big believer in Europe, specifically this idea of creating a European banking and capital markets union.
Interesting. That's been in the works for a while, hasn't it?
It has. It's been slow going.
Definitely a lot of hurdles to overcome.
And it makes sense why he's interested. I mean, he's a major shareholder in a couple of big European banks, UniCredit and Commerzbank.
Oh, right. I forgot about that.
Yeah, so he's got skin in the game, but it also goes back to what he was saying earlier about the power of having a more unified system, kind of like the U.S., right?
Right. Greater efficiency, potentially more competition.
Exactly. So could this be the thing that finally unlocks even more economic growth in Europe? It's a big question.
It is. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
For sure, but here's where Fink throws everyone a curveball. He's not buying into all this talk about a soft landing for the U.S. economy.
Oh. Everyone seems to be debating that right now.
I know, right? It's all over the news. Are we heading for a recession or not? But Fink's basically like, what recession?
He's pretty confident in the U.S. economy's ability to keep chugging along.
He is. He actually thinks the whole landing analogy is, like, flawed.
Interesting. So instead of focusing on whether we stick a perfect landing or crash and burn, he's looking at something else.
He is. He's actually predicting continued growth, like 2–3% range for the U.S. economy.
Wow, that's a bolder stance than a lot of economists are taking right now.
Right. And he thinks a lot of it comes down to the strength of corporate earnings, which he seems pretty optimistic about.
So he's not seeing a recession on the horizon.
Nope. And get this, he also disagrees with all those predictions about the Fed slashing interest rates.
Oh, wow, he's really going against the grain there.
Yeah, I think he even called the amount of easing priced into the forward curve, like, crazy or something.
He's not afraid to speak his mind, that's for sure.
He's not, but I kind of love it. It's refreshing to hear someone who's so focused on the long term, like not getting caught up in all the daily ups and downs.
It's a good reminder that sometimes you got to zoom out to see the bigger picture.
Exactly. It really is. I mean, how often do you hear someone like completely dismiss the idea of a recession when it seems like everyone else is freaking out about it?
Right. It's definitely a contrarian view.
Totally. But hey, that's kind of Fink's style, right? He's not afraid to go against the grain, especially when he sees things differently.
And it's not like he doesn't have a track record to back it up.
Exactly. So when Larry Fink talks, we listen, right?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
All right. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Fink's take on China, the U.S. election, even his love for infrastructure. But let's circle back to something you mentioned earlier, diversification.
Okay, yeah, spreading the risk. We were talking about that in the context of private credit.
Right, but it's obviously a much bigger concept than that. Like, how does Fink see diversification playing out on a global scale?
Well, he definitely sees it as a key trend going forward, and not just in terms of where companies invest or build their supply chains, but also how individual investors think about their portfolios.
Okay, so like not having all your eggs in one basket, geographically speaking.
Exactly, and that's something we've seen play out more and more over the past few years, right? With the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, all these global disruptions, companies and investors have started to realize that relying too heavily on any one country or region can be risky.
So is it all about like finding the next hot emerging market then?
Well, it's not quite as simple as that. I think Fink would say it's more about having a balanced approach, understanding the risks and opportunities in different parts of the world, and not putting all your faith in any one place.
That makes sense, but how do you even begin to like wrap your head around all that? The world is a big, complicated place.
It is, and that's where, doing your research and maybe talking to a financial advisor can be really helpful.
For sure, because nobody's got time to become an expert on every single country's economic policy.
Exactly, but even just understanding the basics, like what are the major industries in a particular country, what's their political climate like, things like that, can go a long way.
And maybe help you avoid some nasty surprises down the road.
Absolutely, because as Think has shown us time and time again, the global economy is constantly evolving, and those who can adapt and diversify are the ones who are most likely to succeed in the long run.
No doubt about it. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. Any final thoughts before we let our listeners go?
Just that, while Larry thinks insights are incredibly valuable, it's important for everyone to do their own research, consider their own individual circumstances, and make informed decisions that are right for them.
Absolutely. We can't stress that enough. Couldn't agree more. Always good to keep those disclaimers handy. But listening to Fink talk about all these like massive global shifts, it kind of makes you wonder.
What's that?
Well, he's clearly like all about that long-term thinking, right? But how do you actually like put that into practice as an investor? Do you just like ignore all the daily market craziness, the news headlines?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no magic formula that works for everyone.
Right, everyone's got their own thing.
Exactly. But I think if you were to ask Fink, he'd probably say it starts with like really understanding your own goals, right? What are you investing for? And what's your risk tolerance? Like, are we talking retirement here? Or do you need to access that money sooner?
Right, because if you're freaking out every time the market dips, you're probably not going to stick to any plan for very long.
Exactly. It's like you got to tune out that noise and focus on those like core fundamentals.
So less doom scrolling, more like actually reading those company reports.
Pretty much look at things like earnings, the
Yeah.
management team, their competition, that kind of stuff. Those are the factors that actually drive long-term value.
Makes sense. And maybe like sprinkle in a little international diversification, especially with the Fink so gung-ho about those global markets.
That's definitely one approach. Yeah, diversifying across different asset classes, sectors, geographies, it all helps manage that risk.
Right, because even if one area goes south, you've got other stuff going on.
Exactly. And, it's important to remember, like, Fink's predictions, they're not guarantees, right?
Oh, for sure. Things can change on a dime.
Exactly. There are always those unexpected challenges or even, like, new opportunities that pop up out of nowhere.
Absolutely. The future is like never a straight line, but I think the main takeaway here is instead of trying to like time the market perfectly or chase the latest hot stock tip, maybe we should all take a page from Fink's book.
Would you?
Think bigger. Like, what are those massive long-term trends shaping the whole global economy? And where are those juicy opportunities for growth and innovation hiding?
And maybe even more importantly, how do you actually position yourself to, like, benefit from those trends, not just for the next few months, but for the next 5, 10, 25 years?
Exactly. So there you have it, folks. A little glimpse inside the mind of Larry Fink and his grand vision for the future of, well, pretty much everything.
Don't forget the disclaimers.
Right, of course, this is not financial advice. Do your own research, all that good stuff.
And talk to a professional if you need to.
Always good advice, but hey, most importantly, stay curious, keep learning, and never forget, the future's got a lot in store. Who knows what's next?
Only time will tell, right?
That's the truth. All right, we'll be back next time with another deep dive into, well, who knows? Maybe we'll get Fink back on the show in 25 years and see how he did with those predictions.
I'd listen to that episode.
Me too. Until then, happy investing, everyone.